Hi everyone, it's Julian again. Hello and welcome to week 3 of the course. Hard to believe we've already come so far. You've already done so much writing. Um, in the video for this week, I want to talk about two things. The first of those is going to be the thesis summary, which is sort of the topic of this week, and that's going to be connected to the assignment for Thursday, the first major assignment of the course, the critical reading response paper. In the second part of the video, I'm going to talk just briefly about some of the trends that I saw in the assignments that you've written over the last 2 weeks, especially these paragraphs. And that hopefully will also help you as you prepare this paper coming up for Thursday, and give you an idea of sort of what I'm looking for in terms of writing these paragraphs. Okay, so let's get to the first topic, the thesis summary. Now you'll notice that I'm not using the words thesis statement, which you might be more familiar with. Many of us in high school, I'm including myself in this, learned to write a particular kind of essay, namely the 5-paragraph essay that was structured in a particular way. This kind of essay, as I'm sure you're familiar with, would include a sort of claim at the beginning, which included 3 different topics, right? And then the actual body of the essay would be composed of 3 paragraphs, each of which would deal with one of those topics from the introduction. Then there would be a conclusion that would sort of recapitulate or restate the original statement, and boom, that's it. We're actually going to be moving away from that model of essay writing in this class, and I'm going to explain why in just a second. The real reason that we're going to be moving away from that model is because that kind of model is in fact very limiting in terms of the kind of argument that you can make. If you make, a simple claim, have 3 topics, and then conclude, none of those topics is actually going to be able to be dealt with in a significant amount of depth. So let's say you write an essay for this class that the thesis claim of which runs something like, the film Double Indemnity employs the 3 noir conventions of the femme fatale, an unreliable narrator, and low-key lighting. The essay that's going to follow from that is not actually going to be a very complicated essay. It's in fact going to look more just like a list, right? You're going to have the first body paragraph is going to say, look, there's a femme fatale. The second body paragraph is going to say, look, there's an unreliable narrator. The third one's going to say, look, there's low-key lighting. And then you're going to recapitulate, and we're going to say, yeah, it follows some of these conventions. Instead of that, if you read the prompt for our essay, you're going to notice that, lo and behold, I actually am not going to allow you to do that. Instead, I'm actually forcing you, you're going to be forced to do this in this paper, to write on one topic, and that's it. So you're not actually going to be allowed to write the kind of 5-paragraph essay that you might have written in high school, in which you just sort of skim the surface of the topic that you're dealing with. Instead, I'm making you go into a significant amount of depth on one topic and one topic alone. Now that's a little bit scary because, of course, the 5-paragraph essay gave you a structure, a way to organize your thoughts and your thinking. You had the first, and then you had the first body paragraph, second body paragraph, third paragraph, conclusion. It was there. And that was probably pretty good practice. So how, now that we've sort of abandoned that, I've taken that scaffolding away from you, how are you going to fill up all this space dealing with this one idea? Well, in fact, you've already started to do that in these first 3 paragraphs that you've written over the course of these 2 last weeks. I've asked you to write paragraphs in which you deal in different ways with one topic. Now, I didn't ask you, of course, to write a thesis or to be making a kind of consistent argument through these three paragraphs. I was just asking you to deal with one consistent topic, and that was it. So now, what you're going to see is that instead of what you might have done in the past, which is create a thesis statement, and then the paper was sort of going to prove that thesis statement, right? What's actually going to happen is the opposite. From what you've started to think about already in these three paragraphs, you're going to retrospectively think about what kind of thesis statement could emerge from the material that you've already been discussing. As you think about that, I think it's really helpful to keep in mind something that I've written on many of your paragraphs, which is these three sorts of questions that a strong, complicated argument or thesis summary is going to include, namely the what, how, and why of your thesis. Again, I've talked about this in many of the comments on your work, but I'm going to go over it just really briefly again for everyone so we get a good idea of the kinds of claims that will lead you to make a good and complicated thesis argument. So in terms of the what, you have the idea that the what is going to include the kind of genre convention that you're going to be dealing with. So if you're writing about, say, the film Double Indemnity, and you want to write about the way that Billy Wilder uses this kind of unreliable narrator, that's going to be the what of your thesis. The how, then, is going to be how specifically, and this is where specificity and detail is going to be crucial, how specifically does Billy Wilder say, use that convention, use or abuse or reference, but use in a complicated way? How does he use that genre convention to produce particular effects on the viewer, right? So that's the what and the how. And the third step in the thesis process is going to be the why. Why does Billy Wilder use this genre convention of the unreliable narrator to produce these particular effects in the viewer? What's the point? What's the purpose? Then you're going to see, if you start asking all those questions, first off, your thesis statement is not probably going to be just one sentence. It's going to be probably an entire paragraph long, because you're going to have to explore all of those different elements. But what's more, it's going to be a kind of complicated and nuanced argument. It's not just going to be a matter of listing, right, in your body paragraphs, there's this, then this, then this, conclusion. You're actually going to have to prove each step of the way how that what, how, and why are related to one another. So that's going to actually lead you to make a complicated kind of argument. So instead of, again, the 5-paragraph essay, which is just going to kind of skim the surface of 3 different topics, what you're actually going to do in this essay is unpack a single topic, paragraph by paragraph, getting increasingly complicated in the way that you're analyzing it, right? So you might start out with a kind of simplistic discussion of what an unreliable narrator is in the noir convention. You might cite some of the material the critical material that we've read. And then from that kind of simplistic analysis of what the convention is, you're going to get into specific analyses of scenes in which Billy Wilder uses this convention in the figure of Walter Neff in a kind of more complicated or nuanced way. And that's going to be the kind of evidence, the nuanced evidence of this paper. So you can see how, instead of just the kind of simplistic thesis statement that leads to these simple paragraphs, what we're interested in is a kind of complicated, nuanced argument that's going to explore a single idea. Um, so that's more or less what this paper is going to be about, creating this thesis statement from the paragraphs that you've already kind of come up with, and then writing back through that material from those paragraphs and adding more material in more paragraphs that is going to kind of, you know, be connected to the argument that you're making. Of course, if you have any questions about that, I'm always available to answer any of those questions, to discuss if you want to talk about the sort of what a thesis is. We can chat, we can G-chat, we can do whatever. Just send me an email and we'll arrange a time. Okay, so that's the first thing that I wanted to cover, the thesis summary, and that's connected to the paper, the 3 to 4 page critical reading and response paper due on Thursday. The second thing that I wanted to cover in this video are some of the trends that I saw in the paragraphs that you've written. And again, you're not necessarily going to use these exact paragraphs in the paper that you're going to write for Thursday, but many of the ideas that you've already discussed, many of the scenes that you've already discussed and analyzed in these paragraphs are actually going to provide you with much of the material for this paper. So you've already done a lot of work. It's simply now going to be a question of linking all these paragraphs in the material that you've already discussed and thought about to a kind of overarching argument in the paper. Okay, so some of the things that I saw in many of the paragraphs that you submitted, and you saw these in my comments, of course, but this is just to go over some general ideas. I'm going to go over, I think, 5 of the main ones so that you have a kind of good idea of what I'm looking for in terms of these paragraphs for your paper. One of the things that I noticed and commented on a lot was that the topic sentence of each paragraph should kind of cover or include the whole idea that's going to follow in that paragraph. A lot of you sort of started in the topic sentence discussing one thing, and then halfway through the paragraph shifted and started to discuss something else. You're going to want to be really careful and include in that topic sentence the whole idea of the paragraph. This is connected, so that's number 1. This is connected to the second point, which is that you want to include as much as possible what the Anteater's Guide to Writing and Rhetoric, the textbook, which you should read chapter 9 for Monday. It's connected to the second point, which is what that book calls signposting. Signposting is really important because it gives the reader an idea of where we are as readers in the argument that you're trying to make in the essay. So signposting is a kind of language that gives the reader an idea of where in the logic or the argument of the essay we are. An example of this would be something like, on the one hand, ... That kind of phrase immediately situates the reader, right? And the reader knows, okay, what we're going to get is, on the one hand, this statement, but the reader is already waiting for what? On the other hand, this other thing, right? So that kind of language that situates a reader in an argument is going to be very important because it's going to help guide us through the logic of the argument that you're making as a writer. What are some other examples of this? Whereas, right? A nice little short word that has so much power in an argument. Because you can say, whereas one thing, and I as a reader am going to know, whereas this, but also that, right? Or similarly, a great word at the beginning of a topic sentence in a paragraph, because that's going to connect the last paragraph and the argument that you were making in that paragraph to this next point in this new paragraph. Similarly, Wilder uses this thing, right, etc., etc., etc. However, right, Another great word because it's going to situate the reader in the logic of the argument that you're making. So, so that's number two. So we have this sense that these using signposting languages is going to be very important to situate the reader in the argument of your essay. Number two, or rather number three, you don't necessarily need to summarize at the end of each paragraph the topic sentence at the beginning of that paragraph. The reason for this is that, in fact, based on what we said about the kind of complicated overarching argument that you're going to be making in this paper, you actually are going to, instead of just summarizing and wrapping up every paragraph, you're going to want to lead at the end of every paragraph to the next point that you're making in the following paragraph. So instead of just summarizing, you want to, at the end of your paragraph, kind of point the way towards the next point that you're going to be making in this argument that's developing in your paper. Okay? So don't just summarize at the end of every paragraph. Look forward to the next beginning of the next paragraph. The fourth point that I wanted to make is about unpacking quotations. Now, many of you sort of dropped quotations in. That's good. You want to specifically analyze quotes from the text or from the movie. But instead of then analyzing in detail those quotations, you sort of dropped them in and then moved on to make more general arguments or claims. Instead of that, I want you to spend a significant amount of time analyzing very closely the kind of language and the context of each of the quotations that you use. So don't just drop in a quotation without its context and then move on, right? Introduce the quotation by situating it in where does it show up in the movie, where does it show up in the text that you're discussing. And then, in addition, don't just move on after you've talked about the quotation once. Analyze it carefully, right? Just quote a big kind of chunk of text and then go in and re-quote part of the text again, analyzing it in greater and greater detail. So that's really important as you're sort of using quotations to prove as evidence for the argument that you're making in the paper. And of course, then the last point, the fifth point, is that you're going to want to stick to one idea. I've already talked a little bit about this, but each of the paragraphs should stick very closely to one idea that you have introduced in the topic sentence, and that is going to be connected back to the overarching claim that you're making in the paper as a whole. Okay, so those are 5 sort of things that I noticed people not necessarily doing in these paragraphs, often because I didn't really ask you to do them, but which I want to see in the body paragraphs of this essay that's coming up. I want to see you do. Okay, so that was 2 things. One was sort of about the thesis and how you might kind of come up with a thesis statement, not a simplistic one, but a kind of complicated one that you're going to unpack over the course of your paper. And then the second point was, as you're unpacking that in the body paragraphs of your essay, what those paragraphs should look like. So again, this is the first big assignment, so spend some time really writing it. But I hope that this has sort of helped you calm down a little bit and get a sense of what I'm actually looking for. Not a 5-paragraph essay, but a more nuanced, complicated kind of argument that's going to unfold and deal with really just one genre convention of noir, but dealing with that in great depth and in a nuanced way. As always, if you have questions or if you're confused about anything that I've said or anything in the prompt for this essay, email me and we'll go back and forth. I'll answer any questions that you might have and give you an even more detailed account of what I'm looking for. Okay, it's been a pleasure reading all of your work this far, and I look forward to reading even more of it, and especially to these papers. So let me know if you have more questions, email me, and I look forward to hearing from you. Okay, bye.